Thanks, Maria. And she began to get into what does it actually take to bring these things to scale. And what I love about ASU is they don't do anything small. So they're never never looking to just have one partner. They're always looking to go bigger. And so as with the work that we did through our regional accelerator, they all also were looking to go bigger. And so what have we learned that will allow communities to go bigger, to get to that scale? I'm going to share a little bit about what we've learned, and we have a longer report that folks can certainly reference if it's helpful later on. At the end of the day, there are some key components that we think are necessary for scale. Sitting underneath all of this work, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, are the enabling conditions, the policy that allow this to happen. And there are certain barriers that can hinder communities from really investing in this work, and we have to be able to address those. And we're hopeful that there are more states and communities that are really looking to make changes to allow that to happen. On top of that is the first and foremost what Patrick mentioned, that cross-sector partnership. Often that is done in partnership with an intermediary. And then finally, the notion that design has to be done in a way that actually is serving students in an equitable manner. So we're going to talk through each of those different elements and share a little bit about what we've learned, and we can certainly go deeper later. The first being that every sector really does have a role to play in this work, and it all starts with a strong pathway model that has been mapped. We learned pretty quickly that if a community hasn't already addressed its design around pathways, it's very difficult to talk about acceleration, right? You can't skip that step. And so for new communities that are starting to do this work, we would actually caution and say, make sure you've got your pathway mapped first, and then you can come back and think about the ways in which you can push in more dual credit opportunities to accelerate. The second is that every partner needs to show up and have a commitment of what they are expected to do, right? So K-12 is that interaction with students and families. Higher education is offering the courses, offering the wraparound advising, which is embedded in all of these models. Workforce needs to be able to actually commit to work-based learning at scale, which is something that is not traditional, right? You see a lot of programs and pathways where maybe 10 students have access to work-based learning. If you're talking about 500 students having work-based learning opportunities, that's a whole different conversation for a community, and it depends on how large that community is. And then finally, there has to be clear and consistent messaging to students and families. Even the notion of 13th year, we found was something that could rub certain families the wrong way, right? Why is my student having to stay an extra year? Is this remediation, right? So really thinking through how you communicate what the acceleration is offering rather than what it potentially is stopping a student from doing. As Isa mentioned, intermediaries really are the glue for this work. They are responsible for setting the table to bring folks together to talk about what's possible and to actually be the boots on the ground to do the work. Schools, higher ed, workforce, they all have their own jobs. They're all working individually and independently, and they need that added capacity to be able to bring this together into a coherent plan. They are also really, really helpful in designing that pathway, in specifically interacting with employers to understand what are the job needs, what does the data say about the labor market, and then how can we make sure that we have pathways that are meeting that. And then finally, they do have the opportunity to lift up those policy lessons in different ways. Some at the local level may be less able to do that. Some at the state level may be more able to do that. And that's where that sort of differentiation comes, in recognizing that sometimes they're actually intermediaries of intermediaries that work together to try to bring policy and funding change within a specific community. We've seen 3 different types of acceleration happen. So just wanted to give a flavor of what that could look like in different communities. The first being whole school, which you'll actually hear Erica speak about in a bit, where literally every student in that school is on a path towards acceleration. Some of those students may ultimately hit associates, some of them may be lower than, right, but still gathering 15 or 20 post-secondary credits. Other opportunities, like we learned and saw from New Orleans, is really providing individual students more of a direct support based on their particular needs. So in New Orleans, it was focused on helping upskill in the IT areas. And then ASU, Accelerate ASU is a great example of the last, which is cohort acceleration, where students within a school are all on the path towards an associate's degree, but there may be other students within that school that aren't necessarily participating in the program. And all three of these are viable, and we actually saw in many of the communities trying to do multiple of these options, right? And so really figuring out what is the best fit for each student and for each school and the community as a whole. When it comes to equitable design, there are a few key considerations that we learned. As I mentioned before, having that clear pathway mapped is an absolute must. And to be able to get to an accelerated model that would allow students to be able to earn an associate's degree, that access to college credit needs to start before the 11th grade. And a lot of our communities actually was starting as early as 9th grade to be able to get students to experience college earlier, to begin to build that credit, and set them up from a schedule perspective to be able to actually access all of those opportunities. We know that high school schedules in particular are some of the most challenging things to work with, given students' interests in extracurriculars and all of the graduation requirements that may be in place in certain communities. And so you can't expect that this will be crammed into an 11th and 12th grade year and allow students to be able to earn that associate's degree. And we think the virtual and hybrid options are a good way to be able to do that and make the schedule challenge a little bit less. Programs have to be specifically career aligned. So there are a lot of early college high schools, for instance, out in the country that are giving students opportunities to be able to earn associate's degrees. But often, most of those are disconnected from direct career opportunities and don't necessarily build in things like work-based learning to really give those students a connection and a commitment to the work that is grounded in their own community. So we think it's necessary to be able to build that in and to work with employers to define what are the right credentials to be a component of those pathways. Students need to be able to have academic, navigational, and wraparound support throughout their entire experience, especially given that these programs are designed to serve students of color, low-income students, those that have been traditionally marginalized in the higher education space. There needs to be a better mapping and understanding of how to wrap students around and make it a coherent single program rather than, as I mentioned before, that sort of trade-off between systems. And then finally, what we heard loud and clear was the opportunity to interact with and hear directly from students and families about the challenges that they've faced in the programs to date really was some of the most useful time spent to be able to learn where there were particular areas that needed to be brought down or changed to enable this to happen at greater scale. And we saw that happening in a number of different ways in our communities. So just a sampling of the types of actions that our different communities participated in with respect to student and family engagement. They each set out to do empathy interviews with a set of students and families. They looked for ways to gather input to actually provide opportunities for co-design and continue to do so. And then ultimately, we expect and hope that more of them are going to be providing opportunities for actual youth leadership around the scaling of these programs. I've mentioned the policy piece a couple times now, and I just want to pause here for a moment and talk a little bit further in depth, because I think this room folks are some, interact with state policymakers on a fairly regular basis. And these are the places where we either saw opportunity for significant growth or saw the potential for really hindering and limiting the ability to scale. The first is around high school accountability systems, and in particular, the four-year cohort graduation rate. As someone who had a bit of a hand in the four-year cohort grad rate, we don't think that needs to go away, but we do think that it's important that states think about the ways in which their accountability systems may discourage high schools from actually participating, right? So if a student is coded as not completing because they're staying in for a fifth year to be able to get an associate's degree, that probably will discourage high school principals from offering the programs. There are different ways to get around this. In Massachusetts, there was a handshake agreement, I'll say, at the state level to change the way in which coding happened. In Colorado, there's actually a formalized way to do that. So we've seen it take place in a number of different places. In Louisiana, they actually give points based on how much credit a student is earning and potentially even getting to that associate's, so that they're not discouraged from doing so. Similarly, we've seen a few states that have actually gone the path of trying to award incentives for participation in these programs, or in general, deeper credit accrual. So Texas, and their HB3 outcomes bonus gives financial incentives to districts for the number of students that are able to go on and enroll in higher education directly. And those that are doing that through high school, it both benefits their accountability system and benefits them directly through funding. Arizona is proposing something similar where educators will actually get some additional dollars to be able to participate and offer dual credit. The funding aspect is really challenging oftentimes because of the way in which money flows to the two different systems. So the ability for this to actually be sustainable over time matters a lot. And our community spent a lot of time thinking about what it would take to do that, to be able to follow the dollars to follow students into their first year. So there's some different ways that we've seen communities do that. Some through like promise programs whereby students are getting some sort of financial aid to be able to do it. Others through more tangible sort of public assistance, whereby certain communities, again, are allowing students to remain enrolled. So Colorado and Michigan are two examples of that. Massachusetts is hoping to move in that direction where the K-12 funding actually will continue to pay for students even as they move into that quote unquote 13th year. Credit articulation and transfer is a significant challenge, knowing that different institutions obviously have different roles and responsibilities with respect to the way in which they accept credit. Indiana was a good example in our process, whereby they've created their Indiana College Core, which is a 30 credit block that is transferable across the state. And they pay for, at the state level, students to be able to access each of those courses freely. So it's allowed them to build that in and then build the career-specific coursework on top of it. And then finally, around the publishing of outcomes. There are actually only 5 states in the country that publish the number of students who leave high school or who complete an associate's degree connected to these types of programs. And so we're hoping to see many more that do that, so we actually can get a better accurate count of how many students are able to access this. And just again, a moment on the cost aspect. In traditional dual credit, oftentimes the thought is, okay, well, what is this going to cost a district or a higher ed institution? It's one more student at this tuition level or fee level. Well, thinking about it in that way isn't actually going to be able to get to scale, right? That actually there's some new research from CCRC that may actually cost institutions money to just slowly and incrementally grow. It's only when you get to scale and when you get to thinking about the full set of services, including those wraparound supports, the advising, everything that needs to be built in, can you really find economies of scale. And so we're encouraged by communities that are beginning to map and better understand what that full cost looks like to be able to get to scale, and it's something that we're going to continue to watch and be able to share with the field moving forward. And I'll just finish by saying we are seeing lots of different ways, many ways to get to many for actually getting to scale. So in some communities, that means just simply expanding the number of students that are in with one program. In other communities, that means taking a pathway in IT and trying to replicate it into healthcare or into advanced manufacturing. In some communities, that means going from one district, like Mesa Public Schools, and transferring that to another district, like Phoenix Union, and then hopefully building that further and further. And then finally, in some communities, we're actually thinking about scale at a statewide level. What are the policy changes that need to happen to be able to enable those pilots to move further and faster? And so we're really excited to be able today to bring some of the folks that are doing this work to share their experiences with you, and to be able to share some experiences from the students that are actually participating in these programs.